Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stoliarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our U.S. Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon of August 28th, 2022. We have a fascinating conversation with you about longevity, about current events, politics, philosophy, with our guest, who is a man of wide-ranging interests and talents. We've just had him join us, Jules Hamilton. But before I introduce Jules, I would like to introduce our esteemed panel for today. Our Director of Visual Art, Art Ramon Garcia, our Legislative Director, Jason Geringer, and our Director of Longevity Outreach, Ben Ballweg. And we would like to welcome our friend Jules Hamilton. Now, I have known Jules for over 6 years now. We first spoke during a conversation among transhumanist libertarians and socialists, which was a very interesting exchange of heterodox ideas. And if you know me, you know that I firmly hold that heterodoxy is extremely important during these troubled times of ours in order to generate the kinds of solutions that can solve the predicaments facing the world today. So Jules is a part of that conversation, that extended conversation, which has been happening for many years. He is a freelance consultant, a filmmaker, and a model at large, as well as a licensed real estate agent. He has also been a life extension advocate for many years, and he has previously worked as an ambassador for Lifespan.io. I got to meet him in person at RadFest in 2016. You can find his website at www.julesphamilton.com. And I would just like to welcome Jules. And Jules, please tell us anything else you want the audience to know about yourself, your recent endeavors. What has been happening with you?
I think you basically covered it. I've been doing more brand ambassador work, so that's very similar to modeling. And I recently started consulting for a new healthcare 501c3, and our patients are primarily veterans and special forces.
Yes, thank you, Jules, for that. And I wanted also to ask you to give us a bit of an overview of how your interest in longevity began. What initially motivated you to become involved in this field, and how has that interest evolved over time? Where has it taken you?
I think it's just a love of life. People were dreaming of flight hundreds of thousands of years before we could fly, and extending lifespan has always been something I think on everyone's mind. However, that dream develops in people, I imagine, is also symptomatic of the times they live in.
Yes, indeed. So in terms of the times that we live in, how would you characterize the changes that you have seen within our society, within our culture, during the time that you have been involved in the longevity space? And have those changes, in your view, been largely fruitful or largely deleterious?
Well, there's only so much you can do when it comes to contributing to constructive conversations. Actions definitely speak louder than words. So I think things like introducing Lifespan.io to people in my network, people that I know, trying to it's funny, Aubrey de Grey talks about something called the pro-aging trance, which I find to be a very real phenomenon, which is this idea that people come up with an explanation that it's not something they would ever want to do, even if it was possible. So I try to just simplify conversations and try to find the uplift where there's no harm in thinking about, hey, it could be very worthwhile to improve our systems so that we could enjoy the fruits of innovation.
Yes, that's very well said. Thank you, Jules. And with regard to the pro-aging trends, how do you think the public's response to the prospect of indefinite life extension has evolved over time? Do you see more receptiveness within mainstream circles, or do you think that the pro-aging trends is still as dominant as it was, say, 15 years ago or 5 years ago?
Well, whether or not the pro-aging trance is as strong as it was, the prospect of indefinite life extension, healthy life extension, seems less outlandish or kooky. I think one of the challenges, I remember I hosted a futurist sessions. I used to host something called the futurist sessions at the Soho House in the Meatpacking District in New York. And one of the guests I invited was Zoltan Isfan. I invited a lot of friends to that. And I remember there was one point when Zoltan had a PowerPoint and he's saying how, some people in the future might want to grow tails or cat ears or become dolphins. And I just remember being like, oh, this is not the best way to communicate the idea, maybe, because suddenly, like, at first people are thinking, oh, we're going to talk about supplements, we're going to talk about stem cells, and then suddenly it seemed like we had devolved into a South Park sketch with if anyone is familiar with the episode when Kyle's dad becomes a dolphin. It was a funny moment. So I think we've come a long way to just elevating the credibility of the topic, because there's a lot of interesting people in the space. And so when you're allowing yourself to use your imagination and to think about the different things that science can accomplish in the next 10, 50, 100 years, you can get very creative. And I think that's great for, I'm primarily immersed in an artistic world, in an artistic space. So if screenwriters, if cartoon animators want to work with these themes and motifs, it's a lot less outlandish to think about those kinds of developments. But really, I think what communicates with people the best is when you're just talking about the engineering principles of removing damage from the cells to prolong healthy lifespan.
So you think more of an incrementalist approach in terms of messaging would work with a greater proportion of the population if you tell them, well, we'll repair some damage to your cells, we'll cure some age-associated illnesses, we'll enable you to live longer and healthier, but you don't talk about radical body modifications, people wanting to grow tails, etc. That would be a better approach and a more persuasive approach for large numbers of people.
I mean, I don't even know. I mean, if you look at the trends now, it seems like very common for me in New York, at least, to see people with tattoos all over their face. I once dated a girl who had tattoos on her face. People that are familiar with transhumanism, like, might be aware of the morphological freedom as a civil right. Tends to encompass things like tattoos. There's these. You have these new trend. You had this gender trend, which I think is kind of a aberration of morphological freedom, and people are grappling with the like short-term and long-term implications and ramifications of morphological freedom. So it's definitely important to talk about. People should be free to do that stuff. But I think what gets really creepy is when you have like governments kind of like grooming its citizens to like do things that are like kind of use them as guinea pigs, right? Kind of use them as I kind of see this gender movement currently, which I'm very sympathetic to. I think a lot of it is like you're kind of serving people up as virgin sacrifices to a volcano almost. It's like I'm not sure how forthcoming the doctors or the surgeons are when you are removing the uterus or the breasts from a 14-year-old girl. I'm not sure if that's something that transhumanism really has anything to do with, but I think it's sort of impossible to disentangle when you get into the broader conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and those are interesting observations. I would say transhumanism is about the efficacious application of technology. Transhumanism is very different from identity politics. So if somebody tells me that they identify as a fish, but they look like a human, I'm not going to believe them that they're a fish. But if in the future there is an effective technology that would turn them into a fish and they want to be a fish, I'm not going to stop them. I'm not going to say they shouldn't do that. That's their choice. And generally speaking, transhumanism is not about declarations of identity. That's up to individuals if that's what they choose to do. Transhumanism is about how do we advance medical science so that it is safe, so that it is effective at achieving whatever goals people achieve or seek to achieve, and how do we essentially advance the scope of individual choice, the scope of individual control. So what you mentioned was that these social movements, they kind of try to influence individuals in certain directions that those individuals might not have chosen themselves if they were in a completely autonomous condition, let's say, if they were independent critical thinkers. But on the other hand, there could be modifications or enhancements that individuals do choose freely, and those particularly relate to health, to living longer, to curing diseases, to getting sensory augmentations. And one simple one could be improving one's vision. So a lot of people have flawed eyesight, for instance, and they want to see as well as someone with 20/20 vision, or maybe better than someone with 20/20 vision. So it's an interesting situation we have right now because clearly, as you yourself emphasized, we transhumanists respect individual choice, we respect individual diversity. On the other hand, I do share this concern about certain markers or declarations of identity being harnessed for political purposes, and one party in particular is doing that a lot in the United States. But the other major party is doing that to some extent as well. If, say, baseball cap wearing, gun carrying pickup truck drivers overwhelmingly identify as Republican, that's also a problem, because that means that that political party is harnessing distinctions that really should arise out of personal choice. And these people are being manipulated to be pawns in a political fight that they really have no genuine interest in, a political fight that doesn't serve their best interests. So it's interesting, too, we've branched into a conversation about politics. And of course, this is the Transhumanist Party. And we try to relate these issues of pursuing longevity, of pursuing human freedom within the political context, because some political action is going to be required to get us to the kind of world we want to see, where individuals are empowered rather than being manipulated. And one question is, what are the best policies? What are the best political systems? What are the best political approaches to get us there? And of course, Jules, you've been involved in libertarian circles before, but as I've mentioned, you are a heterodox thinker, and I pose that as a compliment because you think for yourself and you gather ideas from a variety of realms and you synthesize them into your own unique worldview. So if you could give us a bit of an overview of your take on contemporary politics and where you think the key flaws are in today's very tumultuous political world and where you think the possibilities for improvement are, I think that would be a great discussion.
So I think basically one of the big issues is how our system is baked in, right? And you can't just pull the rug out from under the whole system, right? You would have to kind of look at this Gordian knot and think about how can we scale back, right? Like sometimes progress involves like you take 2 steps back before you can even take 1 step forward. And so there was this paper you sent me, which was really great for what was the best choice medicine, which Correct. I really enjoyed reading the beginning up until the questionnaires. So it acknowledges how the FDA has this do no harm policy that Milton Friedman describes in his book Free to Choose as very counterproductive. And Milton Friedman goes on to describe the FDA in his book Free to Choose as probably the biggest silent killer. And this is because of things like refusing to allow terminal patients to try medicines that could potentially be life-saving if they haven't met these hurdles, like their $2 billion in research and all these other regulatory hoops they need to jump through. So then again, if you look at what happened with Trump's Operation Warp Speed, where they just rushed the vaccine to the market, the whole Operation Warp Speed was they just did no tests, right? They just basically, they finished it, they packaged it, they sent it out. And I think there's a lot of discussion right now about what is the safety of some of these new vaccines that were rushed without the standard regulatory oversight that the FDA normally enforces. So I think if you were to create new regulatory routes for medicine development, you would need to also complement that with a cultural shift, almost a buyer beware shift. And maybe the money that goes to the FDA could instead be put into something like an open source system, like a Wikipedia or a GitHub. The Internet Society and the Internet Engineering Task Force, if anyone is familiar, has a tremendous infrastructure for open source research and issuing standards and protocols to improve the internet. They don't issue directives, right? They're not orders or commands, but you have the world's best engineers working on the Internet Engineering Task Force to crowdsource and decentralize their research so that they can deploy improved technology and architecture for the world to enjoy. So I think and you could look at the budget for the IETF, and you can kind of start to imagine, so if we got rid of the FDA, that doesn't mean we just want to just embrace like a kind of chaotic anarchy, but it does mean what are the other ways that we could provide that societal, cultural safety mindset without slowing down development and innovation. So I think that is a big communication challenge for people who are passionate about life extension. Because if you talk about like, we got to get rid of the FDA, people kind of will think you lost your marbles, right? And they'll look at, they only need one example of that going horribly wrong for them to never see that as a potential like optimal route for developing this new generation of medicine.
It's interesting because with regard to best choice medicine, I think Bill Andrews and Liz Parrish, who are the co-authors of this paper, propose an approach that can help bypass a lot of the problems with the FDA by establishing essentially a parallel track where patients can provide definitive evidence of a particular diagnosis, and it doesn't have to be a terminal diagnosis, and they can provide their informed consent, and they would be given essentially the opportunity to try an experimental treatment, even one that hasn't passed the FDA clinical trials. And in our chat, Rudy Hoffman wonders what is the status of the right to try legislation. And there is, of course, a federal right to try act, and many states have passed their own right to try acts. Unfortunately, what has happened is because the scope of the right to try legislation is so limited, it is limited essentially to terminally ill patients, and the process for seeking the right to try is itself bureaucratized. And furthermore, a lot of the drug manufacturers don't believe they have sufficient protections from liability to offer actual patients the opportunity to try, even though it's legal to do so in many jurisdictions. The limitations and auxiliary uncertainties associated with it mean that very few patients actually go through the right to try process. So best choice medicine is intended to be an easier process to follow, a less costly, less bureaucratic process to follow, and it would be applicable to a much broader patient population, including people with non-terminal illnesses, but people who see some experimental treatment or some newly available treatment that hasn't been through clinical trials yet as being able to greatly improve their health. And they are not willing to wait 10 to 15 years for the FDA to approve this treatment. Now, I would say I agree the FDA made the mistakes during the early pandemic of lack of proper decision-making with regard to vaccines. But I think the mistakes went in the other direction. I think the FDA dallied far too long to approve the vaccines because the Moderna vaccine was sequenced actually in January of 2020 before the large-scale COVID outbreaks in the United States. So had those vaccines been available to the population, even without FDA clinical trials, we know in terms of the outcome statistics, there are some adverse side effects, but the number of fatalities or serious health effects from the vaccines is dwarfed by the number of health effects from COVID itself. So millions of people have died from COVID. You can't say that about the vaccines. So on net, had those vaccines been available earlier, we might have even averted the first wave of COVID, and we might have averted the subsequent mutations. It's not entirely clear whether that's possible. The disease could have mutated in other animals, for instance, who obviously couldn't have been vaccinated. But our chances of avoiding this current situation where we just have variant after variant after variant and wave after wave after wave would have been much better. So the FDA, I think, was overly cautious. And Trump can be blamed for many things, but Operation Warp Speed actually is more in line with allowing something to be on the market and allowing for patient choice to respond to it. That being said, I do not support vaccine mandates. I think it should be up to the individual. I myself am quadruple vaccinated, and I believe it has helped me avoid COVID thus far. I'm actually now in the minority of people who can say that they've probably not had COVID. And if I had, it was so mild that I didn't notice it. So they do work. They do most definitely work. They may not be for 100% of the patient population, but they definitely work for many. And I hope that the bivalent vaccines that come out to deal with the Omicron subvariants are going to protect people to an even greater extent. So with regard to individual choice, it seems that we are in a kind of political conundrum because Trump, via Operation Warp Speed, whether or not he wanted to achieve that, actually would have brought about greater individual choice if the vaccines were approved earlier. The Democrats, and in particular Dr. Eric Topol, who wanted Trump to lose the election, essentially pressured the FDA to withhold approval from the vaccines until after the election. So that was a politicized decision too. One could easily imagine a situation where Trump would have won, and then he would have touted the success of the vaccines as being to his credit. Of course, that's kind of disingenuous. He's not a scientist. He had nothing to do with them. But he might have essentially played that vaccine card and said, well, look, I helped get us out of the pandemic through Operation Warp Speed. And then the Democrats would have been the anti-vaxxers because they oppose whatever Trump supports and they support whatever Trump opposes. So we see a problem with both parties being quite disingenuous on the substance. They flip-flop all the time, and whatever one side supports, the other side opposes. So how can we have genuine progress? How can we have genuine, constructive policy solutions in an environment like that, where both parties just care about winning and they care about manipulating people? They don't care about truth, and they don't care about good outcomes for human beings.
Well, I'm skeptical about the efficacy of the vaccines. I've kind of stepped back from a lot of news. There was a couple of years when I was reading everything very thoroughly, and now I read mostly headlines, and I have my brain trust that I talk to, and I just kind of embrace my blind spots and am aware of how much I'm unaware of. But I have seen some very persuasive surveys and articles about the fact that the vaccines may have been contributing to more problems. But again, this is not something I'm too familiar with. So in New York, the vaccine mandates was very intense. We had to have vaccine cards. You weren't allowed to do anything without them. At the job I used to work at, which was a big international corporation, everybody was required to have a vaccine. When I was actually the exhibit guide at the Met Gala 2 Met Galas ago, and everyone there was required to have a vaccine card. So the environment and the culture here was very anti-choice. But also we had to wear masks everywhere. You had to wear masks in your building. It's eased up now, but it felt like a preview of what medical tyranny could look like. And I think that was a very sobering thing to encounter, where you don't really want these overreactions to kind of then shape the entire infrastructure that you would want to contribute to like a thriving medical environment.
Interesting. And yes, it does sometimes seem to me that when there is one-size-fits-all regimentation, even with regard to a good thing like vaccination, it's possible to go overboard and it's possible to miss the context. Like right now, it's very clear that if you bar somebody from an event because they personally are not vaccinated, one, that's not going to help the vaccinated people avoid catching COVID. And number two, that's not really going to make a material difference in the COVID statistics. We have to figure out how to get these mutations and these waves of new variants under control. And it seems to me that a very blunt policy tool is not going to do that. Scientific innovation is going to do that. Allowing faster iterations of new vaccines is going to do that. By the way, we do have a lot of responses from our audience, and I think it's good to share just to see the breakdown of our members and our viewers with regard to this issue. So Mike Lazine agrees with my comments, but he says he's triple vaccinated right now. Rudy Hoffman says he's quadruple vaccinated in case we are engaged in this virtue signaling. And John H. says he's had 2 shots and 2 boosters from Pfizer, and he will get the hybrid booster when it becomes available. I'm quadruple vaccinated via Moderna, but I'm thinking of getting the bivalent vaccine from Pfizer because I am disappointed with Moderna having sued Pfizer recently, still in the middle of the pandemic, but Moderna has essentially filed a patent infringement lawsuit against Pfizer, and I think that's bad form. I think right now, all of these entities need to be involved in jointly seeking to defeat this virus. And this kind of infighting is disgraceful, it's shameful, and it undermines public trust in what these companies are doing. So there are these petty, pecuniary kinds of motives that get in the way of an actual rational scientific response. And one of the things that really disappointed me during this pandemic, and I'm sure it has disappointed you, Jules, as well, is how human pettiness was not put aside, even temporarily, to try to get through this, to try to figure out solutions that work for everybody. Rather, a lot of people decided that they're just going to essentially try to undermine whatever people they considered inconvenient or the other side as they perceived it. And sometimes for very range of the moment kinds of purposes. Like I'm sure in suing Pfizer, Moderna isn't thinking about the greater benefit of humanity. Moderna is thinking about how to very ruthlessly get rid of its competitor. And I'm very disappointed in this company, even if I think its vaccines are perfectly safe and effective, at least they are for me. I would rather get my next vaccine from Pfizer because that company has behaved more honorably. But why don't you think people have behaved more honorably during this pandemic, Jules?
I mean, I think that's something you can just probably bank on. I think it could just be a simple thing like human nature. I realize I may not have answered your original question when it comes to like the political space. I think one of the challenges actually is dealing with the pharmaceuticals. So the way I understand our environment is we have corporatism. Some people call it late stage capitalism. I call it corporatism because the corporations hire lobbyists and they write all the laws in their favor. So whether you get Bernie Sanders in there or anyone, they're going to, it's still going to be the wealthiest constituents are going to have lobbyists craft laws in their favor. And until you start to understand how the laws are affecting the ecosystem on the books, and until you can start either peeling those back or transforming those, a lot of the surface level conversations are just going to remain moot. I think that so a kind of heterodox case study I like to bring up a lot is you have like the very kind of cringe worthy Martin Shkreli story, which I think is a really interesting one because first exposure to the story, he's just clearly opportunist, right? But when you think about when he starts to describe how he was like gaming the system and it was the government and the insurance companies that would be paying him like through the hospitals, and that if anybody was unable to get the drug, you could just call him and go to his website and he'd send it to you for free. It's the way that the prices are artificially inflated. So I think our healthcare system is artificially expensive. And I think that a lot of people think it's a redistribution problem. We need to figure out how to redistribute the resources so that more people have access. And I think the problem is you see a similar situation in higher education, where we keep subsidizing higher education and the price for higher education continues to skyrocket. And also it's like, so do their administrative costs, where you're not getting more educators, you're getting a lot more people, you're getting a lot more bureaucrats. And the education model works kind of like the nightclub model, where you increase the value of your institution with this sense of having a velvet rope outside and only like a certain number of people can get in, right? If it really was like a factory model where you're just sort of going through the system, you get your education, you come out, and now you have these new capabilities, like you should just be able to scale that indefinitely. But that is not what we see from higher education, no matter how much we subsidize these elite universities. I think this is what also is happening with medicine. Like we subsidize a lot of medicine. You have like these juggernaut pharmaceutical companies that pretty much dominate the market, and they can stifle and essentially just crush all sorts of competition. You had these MIT students who made Martin Shkreli's drug, which had no patent. They made it, they synthesized it for $2, right? So they were unallowed to introduce this molecularly identical drug into the market simply because they hadn't met the bureaucratic red tape standards that the FDA would have required, which is also enforced, not enforced, but it's basically motivated by the pharmaceuticals. Like the pharmaceuticals inform and basically write the laws that the FDA runs on. Does that make sense? Like the pharmaceuticals like the FDA regulations because it makes it impossible for anyone else to participate in the market. And so we have this artificially expensive market, and we have to find the ways to lower the prices. And I think that part of the discussion is essentially entirely absent.
Yes, and there are many astute observations in your remarks there, Jules, with regard to, for instance, the drivers of the high costs that we see. They're not lone individuals. They're the result of a system that encourages upward pressure on costs through a lack of accountability, a kind of severance of the relationship between the suppliers and the patients, or in the case of education, the providers of education and the students. And as a result, in both cases, the suppliers of the good and service can raise their list price because they know in most cases there are going to be third-party sources of payment. Now, on the subject of the students, the MIT students who manufactured the drug that Martin Shkreli was selling and could have mass-produced it if they were allowed to do it, this shows a key flaw in the patent system in the United States, because the patent system creates these legal monopolies even over substances that the monopoly holders didn't create and had nothing to do with the creation of. We have in our platform section 81, which reads, the United States Transhumanist Party supports reforms to the patent system that prevent the repatenting of drugs and medical devices or the acquisition of any exclusive or monopoly rights over those drugs and devices once they've become generic or entered the public domain. And it's my understanding that a lot of the scandals about certain companies essentially ratcheting up prices for sometimes life-saving treatments or devices or drugs are with respect to substances that have been in the public domain for many decades, yet somehow these entities have acquired monopoly or quasi-monopoly rights over them. The U.S. Transhumanist Party platform in Section 81 continues as follows. Appallingly, many pharmaceutical companies today attempt to repatent drugs that have already entered the public domain simply because the drugs have been discovered to have effects on a disease different from the one for which they were originally patented. The result of this is that the price of the repatented drug often spikes by orders of magnitude compared to the price level during the period the drug was subject to competition. Only a vibrant and competitive market where numerous medical providers can experiment with how to improve particular treatments or create new ones can allow for the rate of progress needed for the people alive today to benefit from radical life extension. So you mentioned in your comments, Jules, this concept of corporatism, which is very different from free market capitalism. And in corporatism, the few established players try to use the government to create barriers to entry to their competitors. So the large pharmaceutical companies that we discussed may have an incentive to want the FDA to take longer to review drugs and for that review to be more expensive, because then they can get through the system, but their smaller, potentially more nimble competitors can't get through the system unless they partner with the large pharmaceutical companies. So right now, there are a lot of ambitious startups in the biomedical realm, but for a lot of those startups, the business model is to be acquired by a large pharmaceutical company, because that's the only way they could potentially realize their aspiration, except when they get acquired by the large pharmaceutical company, the pharmaceutical company could just as well decide to shelve their particular project and just hold the patent on it as a measure to essentially sue any subsequent competitor that comes up with that particular idea. So it is unfortunately a system that hinders progress, but it's also a system that gives capitalism a bad reputation in the eyes of many. And this is particularly true of our generation and the succeeding generation now, Gen Z, which has a very unfavorable view of capitalism because all that they know is corporatism. So, Jules, with this public perception, how can we influence public opinion to be more receptive to not what is happening today, but the potential for a free and competitive market actually enabling consumer choice?
So I think you kind of have to embrace the life of language, and instead of miring yourself in a capitalism is good or capitalism is bad conversation, if I'm talking to someone that thinks capitalism is bad, I'll accept their given definition and I will contrast it with economic freedom, where I'll basically say, like, if someone is using capitalism with a definition that is not the definition I would use, I don't have a conversation that's arguing about different definitions. I'll just say, let's work with your definition of what capitalism is, okay? And so we can say that the capitalism we have is bad. It's not working. I'll say I would call it corporatism. You can call it late stage capitalism. I think these are I think late stage capitalism and saying capitalism is bad is misleading. However, like, I can bypass all that semantic mincing of words and just then try to hone in on like the merits of economic freedom, where we're that's what I would be trying to express. So if someone were to say, well, we have capitalism now, I could say, that's fine. I think we need more economic freedom. And that way I feel like we can try to increase comprehension about the occasional conflict of visions people have with these words.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so it's more of a focus on substance rather than the semantics. And I tend to agree with you because in the Transhumanist Party, we have a big tent. So we have some people who openly support capitalism. We have some people who openly support socialism. But my question for all of them is, what sort of outcomes do they want in the real physical world for real physical human beings? And whatever language they use to describe those outcomes, the key is that the real world consequences are going to be beneficial for people. And hopefully in the kinds of discussions that we have about specific issues, specific areas of concern, possible specific policies that could resolve them, we could arrive at a convergence of solutions, even if we have different interpretative frameworks about how we understand those solutions. So some of our viewers may think that the solutions we propose are actually steps along the way to the imagined Marxist utopia where the government can wither away and we have material superabundance like the fully automated luxury communism, where people don't have to worry about getting the basic goods or basic requirements of living like shelter and medical care. And I would say that's fine if that is the framework with which they interpret the world, as long as what their advocacy will hopefully lead to is actual greater material abundance for people, actual higher standards of living, so that people can develop as individuals and be truly autonomous in directing their lives. So, Jules, I wanted to give you an opportunity to discuss your endeavors a bit more. So you co-founded the Break the Rules show with Lev Polyakov in 2018, and I was actually your first guest on Break the Rules. And we, of course, had many other conversations since then. We invited Lev for an excellent virtual enlightenment salon on July 5th, 2021. But I want to hear an overview from you of how you think Break the Rules evolved since our first conversation, and what do you think it has been able to accomplish in those 4 years?
Well, I think it's done a lot to champion free speech, and there's a lot of conversations people will kind of imagine they could never have in the first place. And I think just by bringing all sorts of people and having them share a space for a couple of hours to have a conversation is just a really great way to lead by example, that you can have these conversations ongoing with people that even contentiously disagree, and it can be very productive. And this is not something that I really see in the mainstream. They'll have a talking head for 15 minutes. They'll leave it open-ended. They'll kind of pit people against each other and then wind them up and then, cut to a commercial break. And it can be very sensationalist, but I never see them go all the way through. So I also do other podcasting. I do like a performance art podcast called MK Ultra Money. It's definitely an acquired taste. It can definitely... I like to think of it as emotional exfoliation, right? I think I tell this to people. The best persuaders typically have to make you very uncomfortable first, and then make you feel better after they've made you feel uncomfortable. And that is an element of the art of persuasion. And so on MK Ultra Money, it's like we're all wearing tinfoil hats and we're just it's incoherent. I would not recommend listening to it even as punishment, but if you're into that kind of thing, you should definitely check out MK Ultra Money as well. It's typically humorous, but we're a little serious sometimes. So that's kind of like a distant cousin of Break the Rules.
Very interesting. And of course, I wanted to highlight some ways in which one can support Break the Rules. One can join the Discord server, for which I have placed the link here. One can also support Break the Rules on Patreon. I am one of the Patreon supporters of that show. I'm pleased how it has grown its audience since that time. And one of the comments that Lev made during our recent stream on artificial intelligence and transhumanism is that this is a forum for bringing together people who would never have met otherwise and would never have had those kinds of conversations. And they're definitely heterodox conversations. They're very interesting. There is a wide range of disagreement, and sometimes, as you know, Jules, some people step out of line, but it's better to have that, in my view, than to have a situation where discourse is stifled, where people are canceled, where people are banned or censored on social media platforms, because that doesn't allow learning. That doesn't provide the diversity of ideas that is necessary to solve particular problems. It's like with evolution, sometimes there occur evolutionary bottlenecks where some calamity happens and most of a particular species gets wiped out because the specimens are not adapted to that particular change in the environment. And that's a terrible fate. That's a very cruel fate. But the more diversity exists within that species, the greater the likelihood is that some specimens will survive, that species will not become extinct. And likewise, I hold this as true with diversity of ideas. We cannot censor people. It would be foolish and it would be deleterious to censor people because there are rapid changes in our societal environment. There are rapid changes in our material environment, and we need as many minds as possible thinking about solutions and thinking about ways we could overcome those predicaments. And unlike biological evolution, the wonderful aspects of both societal and technological evolution is that they do not have to destroy individuals. Individuals can adapt in terms of their ideas. And if a prior idea didn't work, or if it worked under different circumstances, but it no longer works now, an individual can shift their position to adopt a different idea. So I appreciate that aspect of Break the Rules. I'm curious if you can say even a little bit about what your hopes are for that platform, and then we can go on to some of your other endeavors, but I'm just curious.
I hope it continues to grow. I hope Lev does live events, and I hope that it continues to change the fabric of online and in-person, in real life discourse, which I think has been one of its biggest accomplishments for me. So while a lot of people may not see it, for us, it has like a very local relevance, right? So I think something we would talk about in the beginning of our streaming was localism, as opposed to nationalism and things like that, where local politics really is just like knowing, who's behind what desk, what protocols you need to go through to reach your councilman or propose a law, or how our government works. And politics is downstream from culture, I've heard. And so it's important to have accessible dialogues. And if they're not in town halls, they can be in online forums.
Yes, indeed. There needs to be a space for these kinds of conversations to occur and for people who are interested in these ideas to follow them. And I've shared a link here to our virtual enlightenment salon with Lev Polyakov for anyone who wants to learn more about Break the Rules, as well as Lev's perspective on that show, please watch. It is a fascinating conversation, and we converse about a lot of other matters as well. So now, Jules, I wanted to also give you the opportunity to highlight your own endeavor, and this one is called Innomatic. So could you tell us a bit more about that?
Innomatic, that's my sole proprietorship. So I'm hired as a freelance consultant on contract, or it serves as a loan out for if I model, act, or do brand ambassador work, which essentially just means it is allocating Jules, the alter ego, or whatever, the intellectual property. It's like it's how I use my business, right? So it's my umbrella. So you can go to my website. I just added a Calendly link there. So you can do a 15-minute assessment to see if it would make sense for us to work together. I do strategic brand consulting. I used to manage a musical group a long time ago. I'm very choosy. Like I definitely have my own taste and aesthetic, and I definitely look for X factor. So Lev is someone that I worked with who I think has had a tremendous transformation. I worked with an artist known as Sick Brain, who's doing very well as an up-and-coming pop star. She just had a song in the new Brad Pitt movie Bullet Train. I worked with a photographer called The Glass Camera many years ago. She is still doing very well with her gallery work. I worked with an artist, Donrique, who has since become a born-again Christian. He does like acoustic guitar, fingerstyle. He's awesome. He's really cool. And yeah, it's funny because the pandemic for me has definitely been a silver lining, because it did help me improve my remote work. Before, I used to use Innomatic just for video production. And so I did a video campaign recruiting Cornell University professors. So I would go up to Cornell University every weekend for months, and I would interview their engineering professors and some of their like chemists and things like that. And I would tour their facilities and I would like watch them work. And so I made something called the Break the Rules campaign, which Cornell still has on their website. And this was all about thinking outside the box, like divergent ways of developing innovations and trying to attract, top tier talent to Cornell University. So it's kind of funny. To me, it feels like a spiritual predecessor to the Break the Rules stream. We had the Break the Rules recruitment campaign for engineers at Cornell University. So that's like an interview series I did. So I would do interview series. I also did some stuff for pharmaceuticals that were trying to raise money. So yeah, I try to like bridge all these things together that at first might not seem like they're related. I did go to film school. I was acting in a movie a couple of weeks ago, just as like a small bit part. We'll see if I have a line that makes it in. But it's nice to like be in this kind of new renaissance, where it feels like we're in the midst of this new Enlightenment culture, where you really can do these different things and find ways to harmonize them all so that they're not just so unrelated.
Quite interesting. So the Break the Rules name preceded the show that you co-founded with Lev, and it's very interesting that Cornell Engineering still has pages about it, which I will link shortly. And it is interesting how emerging technologies, the technologies of the internet, of video communication, have led to an intellectual renaissance, a new enlightenment. Well, of course, we are here at the Virtual Enlightenment Salon. Before I take questions from the panel and the audience, I have one last question for you, Jules, and that is, do you think this is enough, this cultural intellectual resurgence? Do you think it is enough to stand against the tides of darkness that are assailing our civilization?
Well, it's a start. I think people need to create more stuff. I think people also should reevaluate if they're over focusing, where I don't think if you're passionate about something like this, I don't think you need to silo yourself in a community that is only thinking about this. In fact, it might even contribute to its own echo chamber. And I think one of the ways to enhance your own creativity and your own problem solving might be to start other pursuits. And your mind, your subconscious, I believe, like the law of attraction will help you find ways to find roots that tie these things together. And I think that would help accelerate progress in this area. So I really think the arts are very important and cannot be underestimated. And I think since we were talking about Break the Rules with Cornell, a lot of my experience with branding is thanks to one of my earliest mentors, Alan Siegel, who is the founder of Siegel and Gale and Siegel Vision. He's known as the godfather of branding. Like, he invented the NBA logo and like a lot of other things. So he kind of taught me about the importance of branding. And I also love the Transhumanist Party branding with you have like the infinity symbol on the exponential curve. I think it's like a really, really nice way to communicate without words.
Yes, indeed. And you see why we have Jules on our show. He gets it. He gets what we are about. And he has understood what we are about from the very beginning. So thank you very much for those remarks, Jules. I want to share a bit of our audience feedback. Rudy Hoffman writes that you have a widely diverse career. That's good for you. Daniel Twett writes that he thinks our culture is more entangled than enlightened lately. And certainly we are entangled in these partisan struggles, these culture wars. And the purposes of venues like our Virtual Enlightenment Salon and Break the Rules is to break us out of the entanglement. Daniel Twett writes, nice brand name, Jules, with regard to Inomatic. So thank you to Daniel. Now I would like to go to questions from our panel. And this time, let's start with Ben Ballweg.
Jules, thanks for being here today. I wanted to ask, so I had like a very concrete moment when I was like, maybe we can extend life. Indefinitely is a big word. But I know Gennady asked you this at the very beginning, but I wondered if you had like a moment like I did for like, holy crap, like maybe we can figure out aging. I wondered if you had such a thing, and if you could share such a story.
Yeah, I was in the research and development process for a short film I did at NYU. It was my final project. It was called The Vigilante, and it was about this future where neuroplastic surgery exists so you can customize your mind. And I encountered the Ray Kurzweil documentary, Transcendent Man, and I also encountered Aubrey de Grey's, I think it was 2007, TED Talks, where he talks about like the end of aging or something like that. And it was that 20-minute TED Talks and the Ray Kurzweil documentary that really transformed my thinking on aging as an engineering problem that whether or not we find solutions to in our lifetime is something that I just fundamentally believe is physically possible. And once I thought it was something that was physically possible, it was an aha moment for me.
Is there the Vigilante link available or something like that?
Sure, that's on my website.
Love to watch it.
Yeah, I would. Please watch it. Please do. It's on my website, julesphamilton.com. Innomaticstudios.com will redirect you to julesphamilton.com. They're the same website, and you can scroll down there and you can watch my film there.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yes, and we have Jules's website up here if anyone wants to watch his film. Thank you for that reference, Jules. And yes, Transcendent Man is a great documentary by Barry Ptolemy from 2009 that I would highly recommend that everyone watch. And Aubrey's TED Talk from 2007, which was 15 years ago now, is also still highly relevant. Of course, the basics of the SENS approach have remained unchanged. It is just that we have made substantially more progress since that time. And Aubrey now holds that there is a 50% probability of reaching longevity escape velocity, approximately 50%, of course, with adequate funding and public support by 2037. So that's 15 years from now. And to think that we can still be in a relatively youthful condition and relatively good health by the time that arrives, especially if we take care of ourselves, especially if we make good choices in our lives and continue to advance and promote these research endeavors. Now let us go to Art Ramon.
Yeah, thanks for coming on the show, Jules. I know DARPA has done a lot of funding for research into some sort of brain computer for vets who were injured in war. I know they've done other, research funding for other transhumanist technology, again, to help wounded vets. I think maybe robotic appendages, like a leg appendage. And I know recently I read an article where they're trying to fund longevity treatment for soldiers because they have only about a useful lifespan, and in some areas, let's say like special forces, maybe they're from mid-20s to mid-30s, they're in the peak condition. So they're trying to extend that peak condition, let's say like another decade, because it takes a lot to train soldiers and pilots and whatnot. So do you have any insight into super soldiers?
I don't think so. I like to read. I've read some fun stuff that I think is credible, but I doubt these things are widespread or happening at all. Something that's really interesting that I've learned since working more in a healthcare area recently, I recently became HIPAA certified, is that the healthcare industry, when it's servicing the military, does not work with insurance companies at all. So like a lot of the way the entire healthcare industry is designed is the entire thing is regulated and designed to like work in tandem with insurance companies, which I think totally messes up the entire thing, makes it impossible to navigate, totally inflates the costs. Where when the military is doing healthcare, it's all about healthcare. It's all about like focusing on care to the patients, and it's not working with insurance companies at all. So it's a much different system that most people just aren't privy to, right? It's just by design different. So that has nothing to do with super soldiers, But that is kind of neat to think about, the development of super soldiers. What would they do? How would they be making super soldiers? I don't know. That's a good question.
Well, first would be increasing their operational lifespan. So if you've got, well-trained soldiers and, you can extend their career another 10 years, you're getting a better return on investment. So also with Space Force, if you have, people on spaceships going long distance, you want them living longer. Otherwise, you're going to have a problem. You can't go very far if they're not living longer. So I don't think they've had sufficient, like in science fiction, like hibernation chambers or whatnot, development in that. So you're going to need something that is feasible. And I think longevity would be one of those things.
That's interesting. I'm sure that the military does develop a lot of these things. That doesn't necessarily mean they're making it accessible to soldiers. There's a lot of things the military has on the shelf that is prohibitively expensive for them to really pull off or use really. So it'd probably be more likely for politicians like the president of the United States to have access to those kinds of therapeutics than regular soldiers. It sounds like a good premise for a Netflix movie or something. Maybe something with Ryan Gosling where you've got 5 soldiers, and they get some kind of special serum. Who knows? I don't know.
There's been plenty of movies.
It's a good plot. It sounds like a good plot.
There's been plenty of science fiction movies, so they're definitely drawing inspiration from science fiction. So, but I've read articles where they're definitely doing or giving soldiers longevity treatment. So,
it would probably make more sense. I could see that where if you have like a Tom Cruise Maverick, and you're like, let's prevent this guy from going into retirement. He just loves flying planes, I could understand that. They're probably gonna do nanobot stuff, I think, way sooner than any kind of genetic engineering on the fly. So you'll have nanobots that can help you hold your breath for 60 minutes and can basically help you regenerate. Like if you die, it can put you in a stasis so that they can get you back. And then the nanobots will help kind of bring you back. There's a lot of crazy stuff that is supposed to be possible with nanobots, but then who knows what the long-term side effects of just having all your organs clotted with multi-particle nanomachines that are, connected to 5G. And this is stuff that they're working on. But again, if you read about nanobots, they're only going to talk about, and I toured the nanobot facilities at Cornell. And this was over 10 years ago or whenever it was. Don't quote me on the date. When I went, it was 10 years ago. They'll only talk about it in the medical context, right? They will not talk about nanobots in the military context, because the same nanobots that would improve healthcare would also be weapons of mass destruction. You would have these situations where if you just wanted to obliterate someone or create poison alternatives, nanobots can get really spooky really fast. So, but it's still one of the essential domains of Ray Kurzweil's model for radical life extension. So that is part of Pandora's box.
Well, we need to ensure that the peaceful designs are the ones that predominate. And I would say it's similar to the distinction between nuclear weapons, which we completely oppose in the Transhumanist Party, and nuclear power, which we wholeheartedly support, even though older generations of nuclear power plants have safety risks that have been largely alleviated in the newer generations. Nuclear power is a tool for peace and human flourishing. Nuclear weapons are tools of mass destruction, but they are quite different in their designs. You can't just take some spent nuclear fuel and turn it into a nuclear weapon very readily. There is a fairly complex process required to do that. Likewise, you wouldn't just be able to take a medical nanobot and deploy it for offensive destructive purposes. That would take a different design of nanobot. And yes, I think the crucial question is, what will humans of the future focus on? Will they focus on developing the nanobots that heal or the nanobots that destroy? I am certainly hoping for the former rather than the latter. Now, we have some interesting observations from our audience. Ampero asks, why isn't longevity a political talking point now? Aubrey has been on the semi-public scene for almost 20 years, and that is correct. Aubrey originated the SENS approach in the year 2000, and the Methuselah Foundation was created in 2003. I learned about SENS in 2004, and of course, Aubrey delivered his famous TED Talk in 2007. He wrote Ending Aging in 2007. Ampero also wonders, are there any transhumanist celebrities? Mike Lazine writes, Steve Aoki is one possibly. He is. He has been a supporter of SENS research as well. But Jules, I wanted to pose these questions to you, both from the standpoint of politics and from the standpoint of celebrities, since you're connected to that world. Do you know of any transhumanist celebrities? And with regard to the political realm, why isn't longevity a greater talking point in the political scene? Especially because there are organizations that are working to make it so, like the U.S. Transhumanist Party, and to some extent Lifespan.io, though it's not a political organization, it does try to advocate for broader public acceptance of longevity research.
So Keith Comito, who's the founder of Lifespan.io, conveyed this to me, and I think he's right. He thinks transhumanism is kind of icky sounding, just like from a optics, PR, branding standpoint, that you talk about transhumanism and suddenly people are looking at you like you're a creative, like you are living in sci-fi. You're not thinking in terms of pragmatics, and it's very easy to come across as very alien and to have your priorities askew. With transhumanism, I think it's so important that transhumanists completely separate themselves from all this, like what they call gender affirming surgeries that's going on. I think there's a potential to be a huge backlash. And when it comes to politics, I actually think transhumanism is in politics. It is informing politics. I speculate that a lot of this gender stuff that's coming from the left is actually preemptive lawfare, where you want these civil rights cases of morphological freedom on the books so that by the time you have regenerative therapies available, you don't have people campaigning against them as if it's Frankenstein's monster or like some kind of aberrant, anti-natural creation. Right. So if you can establish on the books, people identify a certain way, they want to modify their body a certain way. It's okay if they have a tattoo on their face. It's okay if they do an aesthetic surgery to like change their gender identity. And it's okay if they, insert CRISPR into their genes and change their genetic code to, remove the FOXO gene and, extend the length of their telomeres so that they can decrease their biological age. When it comes to when it comes to the lawfare that I imagine politicians are anticipating, they are, I imagine, thinking steps ahead. So it might not be satisfying to people that just want to listen to Aubrey de Grey talk about the feasibility of life extension. you've got people who kind of understand the corporatist entangled environment with pharmaceuticals and all these vested interests. And they think, okay, like how is this stuff actually going to come into play? And then what are going to be the social and regulatory obstacles? And so I do think that this gender affirming movement is being amplified by PR specialists and politicians. And I think a lot of it has to do with the emotional exfoliation that comes from accepting these other ways of embracing human identity. I mean, I really think it's important, though, that transhumanists separate themselves from this. I think it's totally coherent to embrace morphological freedom without being like a bizarro Michelle Carter. And if anyone's familiar with Michelle Carter was someone who bullied her boyfriend and like convinced him to like kill himself. Right? Because when you start getting into a lot of this morphological freedom stuff, you start talking about Jack Kerouac, you start talking about all this kind of stuff. So I think that people are right to be wary of transhumanism. I just saw an article in the National Review, which is a conservative editorial, and they were talking about how Jared Kushner is a transhumanist. I'm not sure if he is a transhumanist or not. I would be surprised if you asked him if he was one, if he would say, yes, I am. He'd probably just simplify it and say, like, I advocate life extension, right? And it's similar to the capitalism conversation we were having earlier, where someone could have a definition of capitalism that's not your definition of capitalism. So now you're having this conversation, mincing words, and you're in this semantic loop trying to agree on a definition. Meanwhile, you could just bypass all that and just simplify the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yes, interesting. Now, that article from National Review is written by Wesley J. Smith, who is a prominent critic of transhumanism, and he takes pretty much every opportunity to criticize it. I would not trust Wesley Smith's representations. I would say let's wait to hear from Jared Kushner what he considers himself before we attribute a label to him. And this is intended to be as neutral a comment as I can possibly make about Jared Kushner. I just think Wesley J. Smith is an alarmist with an agenda. And it seems to me that he should be treated with the utmost skepticism. Now, we were talking about people growing tails, and I see a bit of a tail in your image, Jules. Who is this?
This is my cat Bubbles. She hisses, but hey, I think she just woke up from a nap.
So you see, we have different species represented. We have different species represented on our virtual enlightenment salons. We are quite respectful of diversity, and we do have some transgender members in the U.S. Transhumanist Party. We respect them as well as individuals, but I do want to emphasize transhumanism is not the same as transgenderism. That is just such a strange confusion, in my view. It's like saying, well, the Transcontinental Railroad was built by people who changed their gender, or the Trans-Siberian Railroad, or if you transform anything, it has something to do with gender. No, trans is a Latin prefix for going beyond or going through. And Keith Comito actually made this point about transhumanism, that there are different ways to interpret that term. And one of the interpretations is beyond human, and he thinks that might turn some people off if they think that one would be somehow losing one's essential humanity. But that's not what transhumanism advocates at all. Rather, another possibility is to interpret it using the through meaning of the trans prefix. So through our humanity, we overcome these limitations, these problems that have plagued us, including our mortality, our vulnerability to disease.
It's like they forget that it starts with humanism. You know what I mean? So, you're starting with humanism. It's like they forget all that part, which I think is why transhumanists can be of such different diversity, and we can still sometimes have some heated discussions, because at the base of it is a humanist that believes in treating their fellow humans, with at least some amount of respect and not being a big a-hole, you know what I mean? So, we're able to have them discussions without, just going off the rails, being rude. Sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
Yes. And I think, Jules, I want to ask you a clarification question. When you referred to Jack Kerouac, did you mean to refer to Jack Kevorkian, Dr. Death, rather than the beatnik?
Yes. Sorry.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you to our friend John H. for pointing that out. Now, Jason, you also had some questions for Jules, so please feel free to go ahead.
You touched on a whole bunch of stuff. One thing I'll real quick try about the transgenderism, and we do have some right and some left in our platform, seemingly, even though, well, I won't get into that. But what I would push for, if we were like having a legislative discussion debate about what kind of policies put in our platform, I would push to be very conservative about children, and that we have to respect the science about when they are evolved enough to even make such decisions. You mentioned a 15 or 14-year-old girl earlier. I'm really not sure. We wouldn't really need to look at the science to say that a 14-year-old can make such a decision like that with an education, enough education to make a wise decision. I'm not trying to restrict anyone's freedom or anything, but it's possible that children have to be of a certain age to be able to physically evolve the brain parts, that can allow them to make a good decision. So I think we should be sort of conservative about children, and, I don't know what that will look like, but well, moving past that, what I really wanted to talk to you about, I'm really liking how you act as your own agent and that sort of thing with your art. And I love what has happened to the music industry and what I see happening to the film industry, and with all these DAOs coming out and the cryptocurrency and all of this, it's putting all of the tools in the artist's hands, and that we can be our own everything now. We can be our own producer, we can be our own agent, we can be, and all of this. And one of the things that I wanted to do with the Transhuman Club is not necessarily to be like their agent, but just put the tools in their hands, so they can do like something that you're doing, be their own agent, be their own marketer, or all these different things that they can be. So I'm wondering what kind of tools would be good to help someone to be able to do that, and what kind of maybe education, what would we need to know to, how did you do that, and how can we provide that to the members of the Transhuman Club so they can learn how to do that themselves?
So it's something I'm still learning how to do. It's been a long process, and I've, over time, kind of blended things together. I think some of the best tools are absolutely social media and the internet. It depends on when you talk about having an agent, it depends on what kind of art you're talking about. I think there's two things. It's really important to have a community. So you really want to have a community that you vibe with, someone that, or a community that will give you positive and negative feedback. Also a community where you can pool resources. You might be looking for a graphic artist. You might be looking for a special effects makeup artist. You might be looking for coders, web designers. And if you are in a community of, they don't even necessarily need to be like minds, but where there's a lot of overlapping common interests, like you can really help elevate yourself by sort of positioning yourself in a constructive community. I also think one of the big challenges, and this might apply for all artists, is like the reaction and feedback of your immediate circle. So a big challenge for me, which is something that you can never really show on paper, is just the day-to-day, like social interactions, like the social pressures, the social costs of just free thinking. You know, it's you'd be amazed at you can attract a lot of opportunities by being a free thinker, but you can also repel a lot of opportunities. And so kind of leaning into that and understanding that there's a developmental process anyone would need to go through, you're going to have to kind of embrace the ups and downs, that progress is not just going to be like the transhumanist logo. It's going to be much more like a zigzag that's kind of all over the place. You know, it might plateau at times, you know, and then it'll go up, it'll go down. But if you keep your goals in sight, I do think over time you'll continue to approach like what you want for yourself.
Yeah. You know, when you're making a lot of art, it's not all going to be good.
What kind of art do you do? What kind of art do you do?
I'm a musician. I've been making music videos, you know, and trying to experiment with animation and, you know, stuff, you know, same old stuff everybody else does.
One of my best friends is a musician. He's in Massachusetts right now. He does concerts out there. So I know he's a music tutor, and then he does concerts like philharmonics and things like that every summer.
I'm getting
questions.
If you know, if I get some like, you know, longevity treatment, maybe I'll start getting back on stage. But until then, my days are over for me. We're gonna do everything online from this chair right here. You know,
Jason is extremely skilled at animation, and he also has been doing some ambitious experiments with AI image generation, including the album that I would like to share of AI-generated variations on the City of New Anti-Death. The City of New Anti-Death is a painting that I commissioned from Yekaterina Valinakova in 2017, and it is also my profile picture on Facebook. But recently, Jason has been able to use DALL-E 2 to create new cityscapes that are akin to other settlements on other worlds built on the model of the City of New Anti-Death. So it is representative of the transhumanist vision spreading outward in hopefully one of the positive paths toward the future that we would seek. Now,
there's going to be all kinds of new cool tools coming out with AI. And so all that aspect of the whole music industry is changing too. And so I think there's going to be some people that have a hard time accepting that, because like I used to be the kind of musician with the guy with a guitar on his back, and I wanted to make sure I could just whip it out and play the whole song, sing it myself without needing one piece of equipment other than me and my guitar. And recently I've had to change that mentality and just think, look, these tools are here now. Everyone else is going to use them. And so I might as well just embrace it. And that's part of, I think, my process of embracing transhumanism. I might as well just accept that this is the new, you know, these tools are here. If I don't use them, everybody else is going to use them. So what's the point? Plus, I come out with better stuff. So it really makes really cool stuff, all these tools. So,
yes, indeed. I very much enjoyed your creations, Jason, and I encourage our viewers to look into his work, his AI-generated art, the animations. You can find them on the website of the Transhuman Club, transhuman.club. Very convenient. You can register there as a member for free, take part in the forum discussions, and make recommendations about how to improve the site, because it is very much a work in progress. I wanted to acknowledge this comment from Rudy Hoffman, who writes, yes, we as a movement need to be very careful and conservative about children making extreme choices. And this is also part of the Transhumanist Party platform. We have a plank in the Transhumanist Party platform that discusses how children should acquire graduated rights in proportion to their rational faculty. As their rational faculty develops, they should have increasing amounts of rights. It's not like a binary on or off switch where they have no rights before they're 16 or 18 and then they have all of the rights that an adult would have. Children need to gradually assume both rights and responsibilities when they're ready for them. But I believe that American society, unfortunately, has become hyper-sexualized and hyper-focused on identity politics. And children have been drawn into that in a way that is deleterious to their development. I would like to see a society and culture that gives children what I suppose could be called a safe space from those kinds of undertakings until they're emotionally and intellectually ready to engage in a meaningful and constructive way with these kinds of discussions. And that's not to say that there couldn't be a meaningful or constructive way to engage with those kinds of discussions, but just throwing them into the deep end metaphorically is not productive, and it's certainly not something that I would support. I don't support any sort of attempts to radically engineer or re-engineer social relations among parents and children, or create a kind of Aldous Huxley Brave New World type of scenario. That's not what transhumanism is about. Transhumanism is about the pursuit of human flourishing, and we have to understand what humans are and what biologically happens as humans develop. What are they ready for in terms of ideas that their minds could process? So it's not everything for everyone at all times, certainly. So that's an important
I'm kind of hoping that we actually look at the science. I would really like to be in my own, that there isn't a situation where the children literally don't have the hardware to be able to, if say our frontal lobe might not be fully formed until we're 24 or something. I'm not saying that's what the science is. I'm just saying we should probably take a good look at the science and not have that lead our decision as to the, because it's all well good to say that, oh, well, the kid, acted good and has learned everything, but if we find out that he's still literally, or she is still literally not capable of understanding certain things or something, then we need to rethink it. I'm just, be careful with kids is my only thing,
Yes, absolutely. And I do think in many cases, more, let's say, historical or traditional approaches toward education, toward raising children actually work better, not because they're historical or traditional per se, but because they tend to be more cognizant of a kind of graduated sequence of human development, and the idea that you don't throw kids in the metaphorical deep end all at once just because of some wish to enact social change. Generally, I would consider myself to be opposed to identity politics, because identity politics is all about, in my view, just declaring that something is so and thinking that one's wishes or one's feelings could make it so. Whereas a more science-based approach would try to consider, well, what are humans like? what are the differences among humans from a scientific standpoint, and how do we create policies, how do we create environments that are most hospitable for humans of all kinds, humans at all stages of their lives. And hopefully we can broaden the stage of youthfulness, of health, of energy for as many people as possible. And if biologically we can be the equivalents of today's 25-year-olds indefinitely, then of course that would lead to societal changes. They would be beneficial societal changes in my view. But I think we need to get there from an actual physical standpoint with scientific advancements. If we were just declaring, oh, it doesn't matter what our biological age is, we're going to act like we're 20 because it's good to be 20 as opposed to whatever ages we are. Certainly I wish I were 20 again, but that's not going to make it possible for me to act the way I was 20 again. By the way, I was a very cautious, kind of conservative 20-year-old, but still 35 is not the same as 20. I can attest to that. So anyway, we are coming to the last 14 minutes of our Enlightenment Salon, and I wanted to give each of our panelists the opportunity for some final questions or comments for Jules, and then we will give Jules the opportunity for some closing remarks as well. So let's see who wants to start. How about Ben?
So Jason and Zach and I got together yesterday, and Jason suggested, we should throw out the weirdest questions we possibly could at our, I got him laughing in the unmiked position. Awesome. So let's see. What do we think we want to ask Jules? Jules, tell us how you were as a 7-year-old. Who was the Jules of being 7 years old?
Oh, wow.
I love it.
Well, I grew up on Cartoon Network, so I think I was just very animated. I think I was just a very animated youth. I was just always had a happy composure and like to roughhouse and, climb the jungle gyms. And this was before everything was super astroturfed, it was still pretty astroturfed when it was 1997. But, these days it's all that stuff is gone. I can't find monkey bars anywhere.
What shows did you get into most on Cartoon Network?
So I was never a big Nickelodeon fan. I actually have developed a informal theory. Everybody I know that predominantly watched Nickelodeon growing up has depression problems. And this is something that I absolutely stand by still. So I say so if someone said if someone's really depressed, I'll ask them and be like, oh, did you watch Nickelodeon all the time when you were younger? And they'd be like, yeah. How much Cartoon Network? And they would say, I didn't watch Cartoon Network. And so I'd be like, oh, that's really interesting. So this is my heuristic here. Take it with a grain of salt. I love Dexter's Laboratory. I loved Looney Tunes. I really loved all of it. I loved Cartoon Network. It was absolutely my favorite. And then they had the Toonami with all the anime. So that's where I watched Dragon Ball Z. That's where I learned about Cowboy Bebop. So I don't think I stopped watching Cartoon Network until I was 15.
So you got some connections at Cornell. They should be able to put together a study for you about are people that watch Nickelodeon more depressed than people that watch Cartoon Network? I hope you can figure out how to get that federally funded.
I wouldn't want to waste federal funds on something like that. No. I'd rather just do an informal study, sort of how I've been going about it.
That's pretty interesting, though. I'd like them. That's
well,
pretty
when's
cool.
the last time? When's the last time? Have you guys? Are you familiar with Rugrats?
Yes.
When's the last time you watched Rugrats?
Late 1990s.
Okay. If you are feeling curious, go watch the season premiere of the first episode, the pilot, the first episode of the Rugrats. Okay? And then tell me what you think about that show. Because it is so dark and depressing. It's like really dark and depressing. But they have this earworm, euphoric music under it the entire time. Right? So you're watching the show and there's this euphoric earworm music the entire time, but the content of the show is like anxiety inducing and depressing, like really dark. And I was like, wait a second, what? So I thought that was interesting.
Interesting indeed. I also remember Dragon Ball Z. Of course, a lot of the time in Dragon Ball Z was spent by characters increasing their power levels, and they had numerical power levels that kept going to higher and higher magnitudes. I suppose it's good for kids, especially quantitatively inclined kids, to keep track of that. It's more of an intellectual exercise than a lot of cartoons would entail. But the phrase, "it's over 9,000," if one encounters that, comes from Dragon Ball Z. So now let's go to Art Ramon. Any final questions or comments for Jules?
Well, if we're going with crazy questions, what if you were in a horrible motorcycle wreck and you lost 3 of your limbs, were horribly burned, lost most of your vision and hearing, and would you consider assisted suicide?
No.
Yeah, I agree.
No. Keep me on the machine. All right. Keep me on that machine. Keep it going. Don't hold back on any resources keeping me alive. I could be a vegetable on that thing. Just like keep it going. You could freeze me cryogenically if that's the last. That's the last move. That's the last move.
Yes, I completely agree with you, Jules, there. And I think it's actually good to have that documented or memorialized somewhere, because for both you and me, our disposition is we want no resources spared to keep us alive.
That's right.
Everything that can possibly be done for us, no matter how bad the damage, if there's the slightest possibility of maintaining us. I hold life in any state is better than death. And I have, of course, been quite vocal about this. And I'm glad that you are of the same view, Jules. Now let's go to Jason.
Yeah, I agree. Even if I was laying there like in that movie, Johnny's Got a Gun, where he's nothing, he's just a torso and no eyes, can't hear nothing. I'd still, I'd be like, maybe try not to let me get so bored. Maybe put a jam box on the bed so I can feel it boom or something. I don't know. But, that's what technology is good for. They'll find a way to pump me into my own little world maybe or something, virtual reality or something, so. But yeah, I wouldn't want to pull the plug either. But I'm a little lost as what question I'd ask. I remember earlier about when he was talking about the masks and that whole episode. We've kind of reached an inflection point, and it's very similar to me that it's like during the Civil War when the doctors were putting their grubby hands inside, their patients and murdering them unawares. It's that sort of situation where, we didn't really realize that when we're standing 3 feet from each other, my spit is going in the air and into your lungs. We just didn't realize that. Now that we know, well, now we're responsible. It's sort of like the doctors, once they learned that, hey, you're not supposed to put your dirty hands in there, well, now they know. So we sort of hit a grow up point, and I don't think personal choice is great, But, that stops at, like when the punches reach in your face, it stops before then. And it should stop before your spit goes in my lungs too, is my, point there. Having choice is great. But if there's a job where you got to work inside a cubicle together, you can't just say, oh, it's my choice not to get vaccinated and then murder your employee, your employee. I mean, if we're going to have complete, utter choice, then we should be held responsible for what we do. I mean, if I accidentally murder somebody, I should be held responsible for that. Now that I know, you can't go back and be like, oh, I didn't know. No, now. You got to grow up, So I think society as a whole has had to grow up, kind of. But I don't know. That's my little rant about that. If you want to jabber on more about it, you can.
Well, I've always been vaccinated. I had to be vaccinated to go to elementary school and things like that. So whatever I was required to have back then, like I'm vaccinated for. So look, I think if you're a private institution, you should be able to have certain policies. I once did a campaign video for something called Jules Home Life Care, which is an assisted living, elderly home. And they had a policy, like you could see it during flu season, where they said, hey, if you haven't been vaccinated, don't come into the building. This was years ago. This was for flu season. So I do understand that. I think, however, this is not what happened. I do think that you had these mandates. Mandates are not laws. Okay, they're mandates. And that there was a lot of societal pressure that was stripping people of freedom of choice. And I'm not sure the logic was consistently met with this, you're putting everyone else's health at risk. I think that's a very effective soundbite. But if I'm vaccinated against malaria, right? Someone else having malaria, right, is not my concern, right? Because I've been vaccinated against it. So I didn't quite follow that, because I do remember that talking point, but that was my main thing, right? Because to me, it seems like everybody that's getting vaccinated, they're the ones that are getting COVID all the time. So,
well, I think
we're learning as we go.
Right. The purpose of the vaccines primarily is to reduce the severity of the COVID symptoms. So because of the mutations, now the vaccines are very good at even preventing transmission of the original COVID variant, which is no longer extant because it's been crowded out by the Omicron subvariants. But for the original COVID variant, it prevented both transmission and severity of the disease. Right now, my understanding is the vaccines boost T-cell immunity within the body. And as a result, if you do contract COVID, the Omicron subvariants may escape some of the immune mechanisms, but they're not going to harm you to the same extent. They're not going to do nearly as much damage as they would have in the absence of the vaccine. But anyway, our time has unfortunately been approaching an end. During the last minute of our salon, Jules, do you have any final words, anything you want to share to conclude our conversation today?
I would tell everybody that's passionate about this stuff, find ways to focus on things unrelated to this stuff, and don't stress if you don't see the conversations or hear the conversations you want to be hearing. Just focus on uplifting communities and things like that. I think one of the biggest challenges to the pro-aging trance is morale. So it's funny, we were talking about Cartoon Network and Nickelodeon. I have speculated that Nickelodeon might have been involved in morale ops. This is something you can read about on the CIA's Twitter feed. Just do an advanced search, type in morale op or morale operation, and the CIA will give you little tidbits of their history doing this. And there's two types of morale operations. You have morale operations when you're trying to make people sad, and you have morale operations when you're trying to make people happy. Traditionally, morale ops, when you're trying to lower morale, is so that people have no resistance, they have no fight, they don't stand up for themselves, and then it's easier to take over their government, take over their country. The opposite is when morale is high, people are more productive, they're more innovative, they're better problem solvers, they stand up for themselves, they fight back a little bit more, and they are more optimistic. So I think if you think the pro-aging trance is just like a conversational challenge, it's not. Some of the best arguments are won not by arguing with people, but by arguing with strangers in public. Okay, so a lot of people will never admit to being persuaded by you. You need them to be able to say like, oh, I was persuaded by someone else, like some other time, like you had nothing to do with persuading me. So I think if you focus on just improving people's morale, they'll become more open to, hey, maybe life extension's not a bad idea. It's just common sense. So if people are down and the morale is low, no amount of like perfect argument is going to improve the morale to say, hey, like I'd like to, embrace more of the miracle of life, So I think that is a really important focal point that just, yeah.
Thank you, Jules. Unfortunately, our time is at an end, but we appreciate your insights and thank you for all of your time today. And to our audience, live long and prosper.
I like it. Thank you.